Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Lorna had a way of walking through the streets of Bexwood like the city itself owed her nothing but peace. She wasn't loud, nor did she chase attention like a kite on a windy day. Her life was a neatly packed lunchbox, routine, quiet, and seasoned with bits of hope she sprinkled here and there, believing someday it would all bloom into something fuller. Her day started with a lukewarm cup of tea and ended with a Bible verse mumbled under her breath as she shut off the lamp by her bedside. Her husband, Charles, a man once warm like yams straight off the fire, had started cooling too quickly for her liking. Conversations had thinned to skeletal exchanges. Smiles came like guests uninvited, occasional, strained, awkward. But she stayed rooted. Not because she didn't know better, but because her love for him was like a stubborn tree, too deep to pull up, too quiet to scream. For months she ignored the clinking sound of unfamiliar bracelets in his car, the sudden increase in late meetings, the scent of perfume that was never hers hanging faintly on his shirt collar. She folded each suspicion and tucked it under her pillow like unwanted mail. There was a time Charles would kiss her forehead before leaving for work, send a midday text, or wrap his arms around her waist while she stirred stew. Now, silence had taken that place, and when it lingered too long, it began to whisper truths her heart wasn't ready to swallow. The day she collapsed, the house was filled with the aroma of fresh agbono soup, a scent that usually danced around the kitchen like a choir of hungry spirits. Lorna had just finished chopping usaisa leaves when a sharp pain tore through her side like hot glass sliding through flesh. She staggered, grabbing the countertop, but her knees betrayed her. The sound of the wooden spoon clattering on the tiled floor echoed louder than her cry. She tried to call out, but her voice was trapped somewhere behind her ribcage. Darkness crept in like a thief, slow and ruthless. The last thing she saw before her eyes blurred was Charles's phone vibrating on the counter, with the name Vanessa flashing boldly on the screen. It didn't surprise her. Nothing did anymore. But even as she fell, her fingers twitching weakly toward the cupboard, she whispered something. Not a name, not a prayer, just a sound, like a goodbye wrapped in a sigh. Her body hit the floor like a sack of forgotten produce, the soup boiling unattended, as if the house itself refused to intervene. And when Charles arrived 30 minutes later, too late, too calm, it was Vanessa who waited outside in a tinted SUV. The woman didn't even come in, just rolled down the window slightly and said, "Text me when it's done," as if Lorna were a transaction, a receipt to be discarded after checkout. He knelt beside her unconscious body, checked her breath, and finally called for help. His hands trembled, but not with love. Guilt can wear many costumes. Saint Germain Hospital always smelled of bleach, sadness, and something medicinal that clung to the tongue. Lorna lay like a statue sculpted by betrayal, still, cold, and covered in tubes that ran like roots under her skin. The doctors used long words and pointed at charts, but Charles only nodded absently, glancing at his phone every few minutes. Her family came in shifts, sisters with cracked voices, cousins with silent tears, her mother praying as if trying to bargain with heaven. But Charles stayed mostly in the corner, shoulders hunched like a man carrying a secret too big for his spine. And when the nurse wasn't looking, he would step out into the hallway to take calls that didn't belong to grief. Lorna's eyes remained shut, but inside her mind something stirred. She wasn't fully awake, not yet, but her ears had begun to listen. Sound crawled into her consciousness like smoke under a door. Voices, footsteps, faint music from the television mounted in the ward. And then Vanessa. Her voice slithered in like oil sliding across water. Smooth, sharp, smug. "You should have left her when she became boring," she said, her laugh like broken glass. "Now look where she is, lying there like meat waiting to rot. You're free now, babe. Lorna heard every word. Her body didn't move, but inside her chest something curled its fingers. Not rage, not grief, something colder. A quiet decision, a vow dressed in silence. In her stillness, Lorna began to gather strength the way storms gather in distant clouds, slow, unseen, and certain. She listened as Vanessa leaned closer, confessing things meant only for the ears of the dead. Do you remember the night she fainted at the dinner party? I swapped her iron pills, babe. You said she was always dizzy and tired. You said she was a burden. Vanessa laughed again, this time almost pitying. Imagine giving your life to a man who shares it with someone else. She should have seen this coming. But Lorna had seen it. She just hadn't wanted to believe it. And now, lying in that hospital bed, she realized something bitter. Love can make you blind, but betrayal sharpens your sight. She could hear Charles outside the room, pacing like a man waiting for a train he wasn't sure he wanted to catch. And Vanessa, still talking, began to describe how she had always admired Lorna's life. The house, the garden, the calm. I just wanted it for myself, she said softly, almost wistfully. So I took it. That was the moment Lorna stopped pretending to sleep inside. Her mind woke up completely. She didn't open her eyes. Not yet. She had one more thing to confirm. One more secret to collect. She would rise, but not until she knew how deep the rot went. Because the next time she opened her eyes, she would not be the woman they buried beneath their lies. She would be the one who dug herself out, word by word, breath by breath, and buried them instead. The days that followed were a fog of fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, and the metallic tang of hospital sterility that clung to every breath. Nurses came and went like shadows, their footsteps soft but hurried, speaking in codes only they seemed to understand. Lorna remained perfectly still, her body sinking into the hospital mattress like a seed pressed deep into dry earth. She could hear everything, every sigh, every rustle, every hushed conversation held just beyond her bed's reach. Her body betrayed no sign of awareness, but her mind was alive, sharp, and pulling threads together like a spider spinning silk. Vanessa came every afternoon, her heels clicking like judgment across the tile floor, always reeking of perfume too loud for a hospital room. Each visit became more reckless than the last. She brought Charles food once, placed it on the bedside table like she was already the madam of the house. She joked that Lorna's silence made her feel like she was talking to a ghost. But don't worry, she whispered, brushing invisible lint off the hospital blanket. Ghosts don't file divorce papers. Ghosts don't testify. The arrogance in her voice was thick enough to choke on. Lorna swallowed her fury like bitter pills. Her muscles wanted to twitch. Her lips wanted to curve into a smirk, but she remained still. She needed every truth to fall out of Vanessa's mouth. Like a tree shaking itself bare before winter, the woman would eventually expose every rotten leaf she carried. And Lorna, oh Lorna, would gather them one by one. Charles, on the other hand, had become a man juggling fire behind a curtain. He wore guilt like a too-tight shirt, uncomfortable, rigid, but necessary. He still played the husband in front of others. He signed the forms, nodded through the doctor's updates, and answered questions like a dutiful spouse. But his eyes rarely settled on Lorna. They darted about the room as though haunted by her silence, or perhaps frightened by what it might one day say. Once he brought her flowers. They wilted within 2 days. Another time, he sat by her bed for nearly an hour, reading out loud from a novel she had once loved. But he fumbled over the words, skipping entire paragraphs, his voice shaking not from sentiment, but from something he couldn't name. Guilt is a strange guest. It eats your peace and leaves crumbs of fear behind. Charles knew the woman in the bed might one day rise. He just didn't believe she'd rise with a sword. But Lorna was not sharpening rage. She was cultivating patience, letting it ripen until it would slice clean and deep. Every time Charles leaned over her, Every time he said, "I'm sorry," to the air around her, she absorbed it like a sponge soaking up spilled wine. He didn't know that silence, when it chooses to speak, can roar louder than thunder clapping against metal roofs. He didn't know the wife he had once underestimated had now become the calm before a Category 5 storm. One evening, long after visiting hours had ended, Vanessa sneaked in through the side entrance, her stilettos replaced with flat slippers, her makeup wiped bare as if sin could be hidden under simplicity. She didn't notice the nurse, who gave her a side glance. She walked straight to the bedside and sat down with a sigh that sounded far too comfortable for someone meant to be a stranger. "I almost told him to pull the plug today," she muttered, brushing Lorna's hair back gently as if performing a ritual. "But he's still soft. Always has been. That's why you could control him for so long, isn't it?" Her voice was tinged with a venom so casual, it made the air colder. "I let him live." Lorna felt a shiver run down her spine, not from fear, but from how utterly convinced Vanessa was that she had one. It was like watching someone dig their own grave while humming a tune. Then Vanessa stood and whispered something Lorna would never forget. "You know what the funniest part is? Even if you wake up, he won't pick you. He already picked me." And just like that, she was gone, heels back on, perfume trailing behind her like arrogance in liquid form. That was the night Lorna decided her performance had reached its final act. She had heard enough. The curtain would rise soon, and this time the lead role would be hers. Lorna's first movement was so slight it could have been mistaken for a muscle twitch. But to the young night nurse on duty, Tamara, it was enough to raise an eyebrow. Tamara leaned in, and in that brief moment, Lorna fluttered her eyelids once, like a warning shot fired in silence. The nurse gasped but caught herself. "You're awake," she whispered, more to herself than to Lorna. But Lorna didn't respond. She simply closed her eyes again, her lips forming the faintest hint of a smile. Tamara, sensing the gravity of what she'd just witnessed, said nothing to the doctors. She only began to treat Lorna differently, gently, respectfully, like someone who was no longer just a patient, but a witness. Over the next few days, Lorna opened her eyes fully only when alone, just long enough to test her strength. Her body was healing faster than expected, her blood work improving daily. Charles chalked it up to God answering prayer. Vanessa chalked it up to luck. But Lorna knew it was purpose. It was clarity crawling back into her bones. Her silence had gathered everything it needed. Now came the time to plan her voice. And when she spoke again, it wouldn't be in whispers. It would be in revelations loud enough to scatter every lie that had gathered like dust on a forgotten photograph. The stage was set. The masks were slipping. And soon, both Charles and Vanessa would learn the cost of underestimating a woman who had once loved them enough to keep quiet, but now loved herself too much to remain silent. When Lorna finally allowed herself to open her eyes in the presence of others, it was as if a new spirit had climbed into her skin, one that had quietly rehearsed its resurrection behind closed lids. No announcement, no dramatic gasp or nurse running into the hallway shouting for a doctor. Just a calm blank, a breath deeper than usual, and a quiet request for water. Her voice was hoarse, scratched from disuse, yet even in that rasp there was an undercurrent of steel. The doctor who came in later asked if she remembered anything, to which she offered a weary smile and a carefully spoken, "Not much." But inside her mind, every syllable Vanessa had whispered still sat like carved stone, unmoved by time or mercy. Charles cried when he saw her fully awake. He wept like a man who believed the dead had returned just for him. But Lorna didn't lean into his arms. She allowed him to cry, allowed him to play the part of the devoted husband reunited with his wife, but her heart remained closed like a fist. In those days of observation, the hospital room became a theater, everyone playing roles, but only one person aware of the script's true ending. Charles sat beside her every morning with fruit and small talk. His voice had grown warm again, but his eyes never fully met hers. It was as if he feared her gaze might call forth judgment he couldn't bear. She listened, nodded, even chuckled lightly at his jokes, all while laying bricks in her mind, quiet foundations for the comeback of a woman wronged yet unwilling to crumble. Back home, the world had gone on without her, but it had left handprints on everything she owned. Her flower vases had new arrangements she didn't choose. A pair of wine glasses sat in the sink, one with pink lipstick smudged on its rim. There was a new cushion on the sofa, bright red, nothing like her subtle decor taste. When she stepped through the front door, it was as though her home had been wearing another woman's perfume. Lorna didn't speak of it. She didn't comment on the unfamiliarity woven into her curtains, or the sudden change in the way Charles walked around the house, like a child caught with stolen fruit behind his back. Instead, she settled back into the rhythm of life, like one who had returned from exile. She cooked slowly, read quietly, answered calls from concerned friends with the softness of someone who had seen death and come back wearing a crown of calm. But inside her, wheels turned. She began keeping notes, writing down everything she had heard in the hospital. Not out of obsession, but preservation, because when you survive betrayal, your memory becomes both shield and sword. She noticed the way Charles disappeared into the study for long calls. She saw how he flinched whenever she walked into a room unannounced. He brought her breakfast one morning and accidentally called her Nessa. He corrected himself quickly, but the name lingered in the air like smoke that refused to clear. And Lorna, always the quiet observer, smiled gently and said, "It's okay. Mistakes happen." But she knew. Oh, she knew. It was during one of her late-night walks around the garden that she decided she was no longer going to be the woman who collected apologies like scraps thrown to a hungry dog. The moonlight bathed the compound in silver, and the flowers, many of which she had planted herself, danced with the breeze like they recognized her spirit returning. That night, she picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. Tolu, her childhood friend, answered on the third ring. "Lorna," she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Is everything all right?" Lorna smiled. "No," she said, "but it will be." Tolu was the kind of friend who didn't need full details to rise. She had always been fire to Lorna's water, loyal, sharp, and willing to walk barefoot through glass for those she loved. They met the next day at a small cafe on Rose Point Street, and as Lorna quietly revealed the things she had heard while pretending to be unconscious, Tolu's face changed shape, from disbelief to fury to awe. "So, what's the plan?" she asked finally, leaning forward like a soldier awaiting orders. "Do you want revenge?" But Lorna shook her head. "I want truth. I want them to say it out loud, to my face. I want them to own what they did while thinking I'd never hear it. And then I'll walk away without a single backward glance." Tolu stared at her for a long moment, then grinned. "All right," she said. "Then we'll make it happen, one move at a time." From that day on, Lorna began laying traps, not with poison or harsh words, but with kindness so precise it became a mirror. She began inviting Charles to sit with her, asking gentle questions about his day, smiling when he fumbled through answers. She began dressing again in the soft gowns he once loved, cooking his favorite dishes, and humming old tunes while folding laundry. But none of it came from love. It came from calculation. If Vanessa was fire, Lorna would be smoke, quiet, creeping, and impossible to contain. She planned a dinner. Just one. "Invite Vanessa," she said one evening, her eyes fixed on a boiling pot of stew. Charles froze behind her. "Why would I do that?" he asked, his voice paper thin. "Because I know," she replied softly. "And because I want to forgive you properly. I need to see her. To talk. Woman to woman." Her voice was so calm, so unsettlingly kind, that Charles didn't argue. He only nodded and walked away, confused, perhaps relieved, definitely unaware. Vanessa, for her part, agreed instantly. "Are you sure she's okay with it?" she asked Charles over the phone. "She's the one who suggested it," he replied. Vanessa laughed. "Well, I must have really won." But neither of them knew the real game had only just begun, and the woman they thought they'd buried in silence was about to return, not with tears, but with truths loud enough to shatter every lie they'd ever built. The morning of the dinner came like a soft breeze, hiding a storm behind its back. Lorna woke before the sun, her movements slow but deliberate, like someone preparing for a silent performance. She laid out the tablecloths herself, chose the cream-colored napkins she'd kept for special guests, and arranged the dinnerware with the care of a woman laying bricks for her final house. She didn't instruct the house help that morning. She dismissed her with half a day's pay and a soft smile. This wasn't a dinner for outsiders. It was a stage for revelation, and she needed every whisper to echo. Charles, unaware of the war being folded into every napkin and stirred into every sauce, kissed her cheek absently and asked, "Do you want me to call her now?" Lorna nodded, her eyes resting on a pot of jollof rice that simmered steadily like it, too, understood what was coming. Vanessa's arrival was set for 6 p.m., and Lorna timed everything like clockwork, each dish, each step, each breath. Her gown was soft green, the color of renewal, but her expression was unreadable, like a novel with no cover. Charles wore a white shirt he hadn't ironed himself, and his cologne, for once, was subtle. He looked nervous. Lorna noticed, and yet she said nothing. She merely adjusted her earrings and smiled faintly. When the doorbell rang, she didn't flinch. Instead, she wiped her hands, opened the door herself, and welcomed Vanessa with a grace so calm it might have scared a weaker woman. "You look lovely," Lorna said, her voice steady. Vanessa, dressed like a bouquet that had something to prove, blinked twice and replied, "You too." Dinner began with small talk that scratched against the silence like a spoon against a burnt pot. Vanessa spoke with the arrogance of someone who believed she had already won the war. Her laughter was loud, her compliments rehearsed, her body language confident, too confident, like a lizard nodding without knowing if the branch could hold its weight. Charles laughed along, stealing glances at Lorna, unsure whether to relax or brace for an earthquake. But Lorna remained the picture of serenity. She served rice and grilled fish, poured wine, and asked about Vanessa's boutique like she truly cared. "It must be challenging, keeping up with new fashion trends," she said smoothly, slicing her fish with care. "But you've always had a bold sense of style." Vanessa smiled, flattered, unaware that every word Lorna offered was dipped in quiet venom. After dessert, plantain caramel with roasted coconut shavings, Lorna excused herself and returned moments later with a small, black Bluetooth speaker. "I want to share something before the night ends," she said, her voice soft but serious. Vanessa raised a curious brow. Charles looked like someone about to walk into a room he'd locked years ago. Lorna pressed play. The speaker crackled, then Vanessa's voice filled the room, smooth and unmistakable, lying there like meat waiting to rot. "You're free now, babe." The sentence hit the air like a slap across the cheek. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, choking, and laced with shame. Vanessa's mouth hung open, her painted lips trembling as her voice from the recording continued to expose every venomous word she had once whispered to a woman she thought was dying. Charles stood frozen, the blood draining from his face like water leaking from a cracked bowl. The recording played on, the confession about the medication switch, the mockery, the claim that even if Lorna woke up, she would never be chosen. And when it ended, Lorna didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply walked to the edge of the table and placed 2 brown envelopes on the table, one addressed to Charles, the other to Vanessa. "That's your copy of the divorce papers," she said, pointing to Charles. "And that's a restraining order, Vanessa, effective immediately." Vanessa shot up, her chair scraping the floor like a curse being dragged against stone. "You tricked me," she began, but Lorna cut her off with a calm so sharp it could slice yam without a knife. "No, you revealed yourself. I just listened." Her words, though soft, rang like a judge's gavel in a silent courtroom. Charles opened his mouth to speak, but Lorna raised her hand. "Don't insult me with apologies you didn't rehearse. You've both spent months crafting lies. Now live with the truth." Charles dropped into his seat like the floor beneath him had turned to sand. Vanessa, whose cheeks now bore streaks of smeared mascara, muttered something under her breath and stumbled toward the door, but not before Lorna added, "And if you think of coming near me again, I have more than recordings. I have witnesses, I have time, and I've got nothing left to lose." The door slammed behind Vanessa, and the house fell into a hush so complete it felt like even the air was watching its step. Lorna turned back to Charles, who looked as though the walls themselves had closed in on him. "You'll move out by the end of the week," she said plainly. "You may keep the car. I don't want it. I'm buying something smaller. Something that fits the size of my piece." Charles whispered her name, but she shook her head. "The only man allowed to speak my name is the one who doesn't use his silence as a weapon." She took off her ring, placed it on the table, and walked out of the room, not in haste, but with the calm of someone who had earned every step away. That night, as she lay in bed alone, a breeze slipped through the window and touched her face like an old friend. It smelled of pepper soup, distant laughter, and the kind of peace that isn't loud, but final. Lorna smiled to herself, not because she had one, but because she had walked away still whole. Charles didn't leave the house on Friday like he was told. He lingered, half expecting that Lorna's anger would soften into nostalgia. But this wasn't the kind of storm that passed with time. It was the kind that rearranged the entire landscape. He packed slowly, carelessly, tossing shirts into suitcases without folding them, pacing the hallway like a man searching for his own reflection. Lorna, for her part, moved with eerie calm. She cleaned the kitchen, arranged books, lit scented candles in the guest bathroom, and hummed gently while scrubbing the tiles. To Charles, the house began to feel less like a home and more like a memory that no longer invited him in. He tried one last time to speak, standing by the kitchen door while she chopped vegetables. "Lorna," he began, his voice barely standing on its own feet. She didn't pause. "You should get going," she replied, not cruelly, but like someone reminding you your appointment is up. He took a step closer. "You didn't even yell at me. You didn't fight. Do I mean that little to you now?" Her knife stopped midair. "You meant everything," she said, her eyes still fixed on the chopping board. "But that was before you buried me alive and called it freedom." The weight of her words crushed the silence like an egg beneath a hammer. Charles lowered his gaze and walked out of the kitchen, dragging his suitcase like it carried not clothes, but shame. Before he left, he paused at the door, perhaps waiting for her to turn, to cry, to hold him back. But she never looked up. That was how he knew she was truly gone, even if she still stood in the same house. The absence of Charles felt less like an emptiness and more like a detoxification. The house, once swollen with heavy silences and misplaced perfumes, began to breathe again. Lorna reclaimed it room by room, repotting her plants, repainting the guest bedroom, and replacing the curtains with lighter fabrics. She changed the locks and rearranged the furniture, not out of spite but as a soft declaration. This space is mine now, and it must look like peace. She began waking early again, not because of obligation, but because she wanted to greet the day before the world rushed in. She would brew her tea slowly, inhaling its warmth, and sit on the porch in her slippers, watching the sun yawn across the skyline. There were still moments when memories crawled in uninvited, when she'd see a shirt that reminded her of Charles's laugh, or hear a song on the radio that once played during better times. But those moments passed, like clouds drifting across a stubborn sun. She no longer held conversations with pain. Instead, she wrote pages and pages in a notebook with a blue cover. Not to tell her story to the world, but to understand how her own silence had become her strength. Each line she wrote stripped shame of its power. Her voice, once a whisper buried under other people's choices, was beginning to echo back to her, and this time she was listening. It was during a grocery run at the corner store that Lorna saw Vanessa again. She didn't expect it. She'd walked in for yam, tomatoes, and a small bottle of groundnut oil. But there, by the soap aisle, stood the woman who had once mocked her unconscious body. Vanessa looked smaller somehow. Her hair wasn't done. Her face was bare. And her eyes, once loud with arrogance, now darted like a bird unsure of its next branch. Their eyes met. A long second passed. Vanessa tried to smile, but it barely formed. "Lorna," she said, her voice stripped of the confidence it once wore like jewelry. Lorna nodded once. "Vanessa." There was no bitterness in her tone, no need to scald. Just acknowledgement, like passing a stranger who once borrowed your umbrella and never returned it. Vanessa shifted awkwardly. "I didn't think I'd see you here." Lorna looked at her, then at the detergent in Vanessa's basket. "We all come back to clean something," she replied, picking up her oil and walking away. She didn't turn to check if Vanessa followed. Some people you leave behind not with fury, but with indifference that tastes far more final than revenge. Outside the store, the air was thick with impending rain. Lorna stood under a small shed, holding her bag tightly, and smiled to herself, not out of triumph, but because seeing Vanessa had proven something, that she no longer feared shadows. She had lived through night, and now walked in daylight with her head high, her spirit intact, and her silence louder than a stadium full of screams. Later that week, Lorna sat at a small cafe with Tolu again. They spoke less like friends catching up, and more like co-authors closing the final chapter of a shared story. "So what now?" Tolu asked, stirring her drink slowly. Lorna sipped her tea before replying. "Now I live. Not for healing, not for closure, not to prove a point. Just to live." Tolu smiled, her eyes glistening. "You're different now," she said. "You look lighter, like someone who let go of something heavy." Lorna tilted her head thoughtfully. "I didn't let go," she said. "I handed it back to its owner." They laughed quietly, the sound soft like wind through tall grass. Before they left, Tolu reached across the table. "You ever think about telling your story? Helping other women through it?" Lorna considered it. "Maybe," she said. "But not today. Today, I just want to taste peace in my food and feel the sun on my face." And that evening, as she returned home, the sky broke into orange and lavender streaks, the kind of sunset that felt like a curtain call on a play that ended exactly as it should. She stood by her front door, keys in hand, heart steady. There were no applause, no spotlights. Just the quiet knowledge that she had walked through fire and come out with her soul still wrapped in silk. She entered her home, not a victim, not a survivor, but a woman who had once been broken and now bloomed exactly where the cracks had tried to swallow her. 3 months after Charles walked out of her life, the rhythm of peace began to beat steadily through Lorna's home like a familiar drum played gently at dusk. There were no sharp noises, no late-night arguments muffled behind closed doors, no footsteps that paused awkwardly outside the bedroom before deciding to enter or retreat. Instead, her mornings were spent in soft silence, punctuated by birdsong and the light clatter of dishes. She had grown used to the sound of her own thoughts again, no longer racing, no longer rehearsing pain. Her heart didn't jump when the doorbell rang, and her eyes no longer scanned the driveway for his car. The absence that once echoed like a canyon had become a spacious room where peace now lived permanently. She would sit in her reading chair, wrapped in a loose shawl, sometimes sipping tea, sometimes just watching the leaves dance outside her window. On one such morning she received a letter with no return address. It was from Charles. The handwriting was still the same, sturdy, slightly slanted, confident on the surface. He wrote of regret, of brokenness, of how he had underestimated her silence and misunderstood her stillness. "You never shouted," the letter read, and somehow that hurt more than if you had. Lorna folded the letter gently, placed it in the drawer beside her bed, and whispered, "Good." Not out of spite, but out of closure. Sometimes forgiveness is not about letting someone back in. It's about letting their voice no longer live rent-free in your peace. Later that week, she stood in her garden with a small pair of pruning shears, trimming dead leaves off her hibiscus shrubs. The sun was high, but not harsh, and the scent of moist soil filled the air like an old hymn. Her hands moved slowly, carefully, treating each plant like a memory being reshaped. Gardening had always been therapeutic for her, but now it carried deeper meaning. With every snip, she felt as if she was cutting away not just leaves, but the remnants of sorrow that had once wrapped themselves around her ribs. The gardener who used to assist Charles had stopped showing up, but Lorna didn't mind. She preferred her own company. She noticed how the plants had begun to bloom again, almost as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for her return. The lemon tree she once thought wouldn't survive the drought had begun sprouting new leaves. Life, it seemed, had a way of returning when the noise disappeared. As she leaned down to water a stubborn patch of lilies, her neighbor, Mrs. Adeyemi, waved from across the fence. "Lorna, you're glowing this one you're shining like fresh mango. Hope there's good news?" Lorna chuckled, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Peace is good news, Ma," she replied. The older woman nodded approvingly. "Yes, now. That kind of peace that fits like tailor-made cloth." And truly, Lorna felt it in her bones. This quiet joy wasn't borrowed, begged, or built around someone else's presence. It was hers. One Saturday afternoon, Lorna took a walk to a nearby bookshop tucked between a bakery and a boutique, a place she hadn't visited in nearly a year. The owner, Mr. Emeka, recognized her instantly and beamed. "Madam Teacher, we missed you," he said, his hands dusted with flour from the cinnamon rolls he was always baking at the back. "Where did you run to?" She smiled, running her fingers along the spines of books. "Just went into the earth to grow new roots," she said softly. He blinked, not quite understanding, but offered her a warm drink anyway. She browsed for nearly an hour before picking out a journal with a soft leather cover. It wasn't for notes or pain or secrets, just blank pages for a future she no longer feared. On her way out, she saw a young couple arguing outside the boutique. The woman's face was twisted with frustration, the man rolling his eyes and checking his phone. Lorna paused only briefly and then continued walking. Once upon a time, that was her, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be seen. But not anymore. That evening, as she sat on her rooftop balcony, a light breeze brushed her face, carrying the faint scent of bread, soap, and life moving on. She opened the journal to the first page and wrote only one sentence. "I am not the silence they left. I am the voice I chose." Then she closed it, leaned back, and let the dusk wrap around her like a prayer answered quietly. The real turning point came on the day she was asked to speak at a women's gathering in City Hall. Tolu had nominated her quietly, without asking for permission, believing that Lorna's story, told her own way, could help others stuck in storms they had no words for. At first, Lorna declined, but one morning she woke with a stillness so deep it told her, "It's time." And so she accepted. On the day of the event, she wore a simple dress and flat shoes. No makeup, no earrings, just her. When she stood at the podium, the microphone trembling slightly under her touch, the room fell into silence. She didn't introduce herself with accolades or pain. She simply said, "There was a time I almost died, not from illness, but from love turned sideways. But I heard everything, and I saw more in silence than I ever did in noise." The room breathed with her as she spoke, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with clarity so sharp it sliced through the tension. At the end of her story, she didn't wait for applause. She just nodded, stepped down, and walked out into the afternoon light. That night, back at home, She climbed into bed, pulled the covers to her chin, and exhaled deeply. Not because it was over, but because her beginning had finally arrived. And in that still moment, with no husband beside her, no enemy hiding in her home, and no wound left unspoken, Lorna slept, not like someone escaping, but like someone who had won a war without lifting a sword. Sometimes the loudest strength is the one that walks away in silence, holding its peace like treasure. You don't always have to fight to win. Some victories come when you choose yourself, when you stop chasing people who ran when you needed them most, and when you remember that your calm is not weakness, it's wisdom in soft clothing. Guard your heart, protect your peace, and don't be afraid to start again with both hands free and your head held high. Healing is not noise, it's the quiet decision to stop bleeding for those who never tried to bandage your wounds. May your silence speak louder than betrayal. May your strength not shout, but shake the ground beneath every lie spoken against you. May peace rise for you like morning light, soft, steady, and impossible to stop. May the ones who buried your worth live long enough to see you bloom in places they thought you'd never grow again. May God open doors where deceit once stood and prepare a table for you in rooms where you were once mocked. May your heart never kneel again to confusion or disrespect. May your story turn into someone's survival guide. And may every listener say this with fire in their chest and joy in their bones. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.